Hello again from the Regcast team. Today we're talking about virtualization and security. You're going through virtualization. Does that make your IT infrastructure more secure or less secure? We might have some surprising things to tell you about that today. And to tell us about it, with great power comes great responsibility. And the power today from Microsoft. Neil, you're very familiar in the studio now. But where are your friends? Normally you bring some of your users with you.
Yeah, so we tried to get a number of customers to come and talk about their security challenges. And not surprisingly, they were a bit reticent to talk openly about what issues they've seen in security and what they've done about it. What we've done is take that information and provide it today, but the customers would rather remain nameless.
Well, two good things. At least we still have you, and it does mean that there's going to be biscuits left over afterwards, because you know, like when you bring the customers in. Honestly. And also from our old mates, Freeform Dynamics. Tony, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Tim.
And it's glad to see that you're still keeping standards up with a tie horses today.
Yep. Someone has to wear a tie.
I like a well-dressed man in the studio. Now we're going to introduce. We've got to explain the interface to you. You might have seen this before, but yeah, no, some of you won't have done. So if you look up above us here, then there's how you ask questions. Please do ask questions to us, because it's important that we know what you want to have answered. Give us your feedback. Don't give it to us now. Wait until you've actually seen the thing to give the feedback. That makes it more interesting, and more relevant, really. You can download the slides. You can get our speaker bios. There's a little bit of help there. And if you look up in the top corner, that's where the slides are. But also, there's a lot of words on some of the slides today. So I would recommend that you download them and you can have a look at them afterwards, because there's some interesting detail stuff that the guys got for later. So let's crack on with this. Tony, security is a problem that's always been with us. Is it the same old problems in the virtualized environment?
Some of the issues are the same, others are new. It's like everything in IT. IT keeps changing, but the problems we have is actually keeping up with the change more often than not. And we've always said, when we've gone out to ask the register readers what's on their minds when it comes to security, and usually it boils down to process and knowledge and getting access to good practice to make things better. And we're going to cover a lot of that stuff in the course of the next hour.
OK, so what do we know about security, then, from what the Reg audience is telling us?
Well, let's go through just a few very quick slides with lots of words on, because we know that you really like words, Tim, despite saying otherwise. So as we go through here, on the first slide, we've basically got the chart on what's everyone doing on their IT today. So what's going on? And as we can see here, when it comes to security, something that surprised us when we actually took this chart the first time, when we got the results from the register audience, is that rather than being seen as something in and of itself, security is now basically considered to be part of managing IT, doing IT well. And that's a big philosophical change almost that the guys out there have undergone over the course of certainly the last 5 years, maybe even the last 10 or 15 years, whereas in the past security has always been something that wrapped up nice and tight on itself. And as IT's changed, it's become actually perceived that, no, frankly, we've got to do things right. And it's necessary to keep IT running properly. And that ties in, of course, very neatly with some of the factors that we're going to be talking about with virtualization. Because one of the big things that comes out of virtualization is this idea that you can change things really quickly.
Right.
And we all know from our past experiences that the biggest cause of service interruptions and introducing new openings for people to do things either wrong or deliberately to change things is when we change the systems themselves. And changing quickly without good process wrapped around it obviously opens up threats there. So the idea that people can now see that doing IT properly is the main area where security really applies, rather than something tied up on its own, is interesting.
I think it's also quite a big thing that I think virtualization is something that needs a lot of insight from IT to understand what the effects are, what the changes are, what you need to do in order to have secure virtualized infrastructure. Virtualization is a technology, and I think IT has a particular role to play in understanding and delivering security across the virtualization space.
And also, I noticed we're being quite strategic, quite high level about this. We're not going to be talking today about particular attacks or viruses and worms and things like that?
No, I think the important thing today is to talk about if you're managing IT infrastructure, virtualized IT infrastructure, what is it you need to understand and what is it you need to do? So we are trying to look at the practical side of it. What does virtualization change? What's actually the same? Where does it help you to make things more secure? But we're not going to be looking at, well, how do rootkits work and those sorts of things. We have got a bit of practical tip type stuff at the end in terms of where are some of the key threats and how should you protect against them. But it's more of a practical session rather than a technical analysis of rootkits.
It's a different Regcast. I'm sure we'll come round to that sooner.
If we tried to get into the technologies of each of the individual solution areas or each of the threat areas, then we'd be here forever and a day. And of course, that really wouldn't help anybody anyway because their own particular scenarios are quite different.
Well, they'd be on here listening to what the threat was, and someone would be attacking them.
Exactly.
They've got an hour. They've got to get out of it, and then they've got to get on with it. All right, talking to getting on with it. Come on, let's have a look. What else do we know from the Reg audience?
So what do we know? We've basically asked the Reg audience in the past, what's actually going on, and in particular, how do you characterise the level of security awareness in your organisation as a whole? And
the blue bars are pretty small on this one.
The dark blue bars are extremely small on this one, and perhaps most worryingly of all, but I'm sure completely unsurprising to everybody out there watching, is that if you look at how seriously is IT security taken by the general workforce?
Not at all.
Yeah, you can barely see the blue bar on the left-hand side there. Yeah. It's way less than 10%. We know from the past, prior to virtualization, prior to almost from the time when PCs first came into the business, that people have a very relaxed attitude to IT security, and that goes across the whole breadth of things. Either it's something that's not going to happen to us, or it's somebody else's problem. So if something breaks or we get an infection or something goes wrong, then we pick up the phone and call the IT guys to get in, and they'll come and fix it. They'll probably be grumbling when they come and fix it and beat us around the ears, but they'll come and fix it, so it doesn't really matter too much. All the way through to things like putting on pirated software, Lots of the general workforce just don't take things like this too seriously. And perhaps more worrying even than the low level of security awareness in the general population out there, if we look at the senior business manager awareness of security.
It's not much better, is it?
It's not much better. It may be twice as many, but it's still a very low proportion of the overall population. And given that a lot of the threats that come into IT are not always as a direct consequence of the technology itself. It's more to do with how people use IT. And there's a lot of sophisticated work that the malicious elements out there have gone into to try and work out the social engineering criteria to get people to do stuff that they shouldn't do. And it's making it easy for people because lots of the general population and the business leaders do not understand security well enough to know what not to do.
And to be clear, again, this is across virtualised and non-virtualised environments.
It's about both. But the point is that because virtualisation is introducing this concept in business leaders' minds that things can change even more quickly, that's putting on that pressure to change things more quickly without perhaps always investigating that we've secured them properly when we're making the changes. So getting that right process wrapped in there.
So my reading of this is mostly in the business that is coming through here is everyone's leaving security to IT. So IT security is IT's problem. IT is expected to fix it and make sure things don't happen. And if there are viruses or infections that get in, then end users and the business, from this evidence, is saying, well, actually, IT should have stopped that. IT should have prevented that. So I think there is a real focus and a responsibility that's being put onto IT for security generally. And again, from a virtualization point of view, IT are the people who understand virtualization. No one else is going to do this.
Yes.
Yeah. But we do need to make sure that this social side of things is not completely forgotten, because helping people to understand what they can and can't do, whether it's browsing sites or downloading material, all of the usual things have been around for a long time. are coming into play more and more. And the fact that virtualization makes it quicker for the business to change its IT systems, there's the flip side of that, that it also helps to a degree the guys trying to attack into the business too, that they can spin up things more quickly as well. So the virtualization is certainly a double-edged sword on that side. So getting that social awareness up is an important factor.
So the specific risks that we're looking at here, it's really what you would expect. But again, some of the blue bars down near the bottom are quite small. Once you get down below, the top 3, then nothing's a major consideration for the majority.
For the majority, yeah. And it's interesting that even amongst those top 2 or 3 bars there, so that the loss of business critical information and illicit use of confidential information, virtualization can actually make that easier for someone to pick up an entire virtual machine and walk out of the business with it. Yeah. And if there's data and information kept within that, then that's obviously a threat. And a much simpler threat for people to get hold of that whole machine rather than having to physically pick up a whole server and walk out with it. That tends to be noticed. Yes. Not always, I'll admit, but usually people would notice you walking out with a big blade system.
Or equally coming in. So if you want to spin up a virtual machine in order to create an exploit or to contaminate other machines, it's much simpler to do that than it is to physically install a server in the data center rack or install some kind of hardware, which tends to be better controlled.
Mm-hmm. And the second point in there that people consider downtime of IT systems, well, surely virtualization can really help address that one by giving you the ability to recover much more quickly than in the past. So again, there's some benefits there from virtualization as well as potential holes. But as you move down that list, as you say, there are some things that people are not doing that maybe become much more important going forward. And some of them are pretty foundational anyway. Things like identity management. It's a big area in here that sorry, it's on the next slide, but criminal activity, malicious damage, all of these are both helped by virtualization because that speed of doing things more quickly means that even accidentally changing stuff, and that's where a lot of the problems come with systems becoming insecure, by people just making change quickly without going through the due process to get everything teed up the way it should be and configured properly. We can spin up a new machine that's been downloaded off the internet and fire it up. We check to make sure that it's doing what it should be doing, that it's come from a reputable source. That speed and image that virtualization has really been pushing people to work perhaps more quickly than their processes are capable of keeping up at the moment. And that's a big risk that's really enhanced here.
So to sum up these last few slides, if your systems are broken, your IT security systems are broken, then virtualization isn't going to fix anything, and it might make some things worse.
It's certainly not going to fix things on its own.
Yeah.
But then again, that's pretty much IT as usual.
And I think the focus also in a lot of these is you need to look at security overall, and 80% of security is not going to change for virtualization. So doing the basics right is the most significant thing.
Absolutely.
So it's very easy to focus on one particular technology or to look at virtualization as a separate case. But you need to, first of all, think about the 80% of security and doing the basics.
I suppose because the risk is as well, you might end up just getting another product in, or getting getting some more stuff in, and complicating things. Rather,
you could certainly argue that people's approach to security is to buy another product, and evidence of history indicates that that doesn't solve any problem.
Or different teams. So very often the way virtualization has been introduced, and I don't know if it's the case within the audience at the moment, they may want to feedback.
They might want to tell us,
but typically what I've seen in customers is initially virtualization comes in as a separate virtualization team that do things differently because it's a new technology and new product.
I see, good point.
And that's where you get the inconsistency.
It's a good point, that might be something, if you could let us know about that, how you're handling that at the moment, then it will give the guys a good fix on where you are, and so they'll be able to...
So a lot of big customers that I talk to have a team for running, say, Windows if it's running virtualized, and a separate team for running it if it's physical. And that just means that they do things differently, and that there's the risk there not only of increased cost, obviously, but actually that security isn't handled in the same way in both.
It's interesting on this slide that the breach of building security is something identified as a major consideration by half of people, but people do break in and take things away. It might not be every day that someone walks out with a server.
I couldn't get away with it, but you probably could, actually.
Well, with a name like Lock, you certainly would hope so. But people do not always consider physical security of their IT systems as being a major factor. But with the ability to remove a virtual machine on a small USB drive in your pocket, then that physical security adds a new dimension in virtualization. That it's much easier to essentially steal that whole physical machine just on a USB stick.
Now let's have a look at what people are doing now to about those security threats.
So what are they doing now? What we can see here, it's all the usual stuff that you'd expect.
And I'm assuming, as usual, the 20-odd% of you say that you're not doing any antivirus or anti-spam, you've got no firewall or anything. I assume you're just having a laugh.
Yeah.
You know.
But by and large, we can see that most people are doing the basics, at least to some degree or another. What we do find, though, is as we move down the list, some of the newer systems that have a really important role to play across securing the infrastructure generally, never mind in virtualized environments, are perhaps not as widely deployed as you might otherwise have thought they should be. Things like even identity management isn't that high up on the list. There's a number of people not doing it well. In many organizations, they're actually using multiple identity management systems, which again, with the ability to create machines much more quickly, how are they tied in together?
I mean, I don't do this day to day, but I would have thought multiple identity management systems is the opposite of identity management.
I would not disagree with you, but for a whole bunch of different reasons, sometimes political, sometimes historical, sometimes to do with the fact that the business is a result of mergers or consolidations, it happens. Or indeed, just things were built in different silos. Yeah. And until, the very recent past, identity management didn't always have the capability to span all of the infrastructure that people were using. That's changing now, but again, it's been one of those things that hasn't been seen as being a major project that forces its way to the top of the budget, or importantly, forces its way to the top of getting the IT time to do something about it.
Yeah, it's easy for me to criticise.
But it's very much that foundation thing. You've got to know what you've got and who's using it and getting that right. But as you go down further, some of the things that are becoming more relevant, perhaps, are things looking at behavioural analysis and forensics. Because do we have a good idea of how machines are used in normal operations, whether they're physical or virtual? But when we move into a more flexible IT environments, do we know when that behaviour is changing and something odd is happening? Like, is the business really doing something different in a process? Or is somebody doing something from the outside that they shouldn't be? Is somebody working on the inside trying to break things or to do stuff that they shouldn't be doing, accessing information that's not really theirs?
Yeah, this looks like it's way off the radar of most of the Reg audience. Is that true from your experience?
I think what we're seeing is a move downwards. So as organisations invest more in virtualisation, they recognise the need to move further down to these more sophisticated tools in order to have the control over the infrastructure that they need. And I think our audience would be interesting to know, again, if they're looking at some of the elements lower down this list once their use of virtualisation starts to extend, because the evidence I'm seeing with customers is they start to realise they need better tools and better controls through some of these tools.
Okay. And certainly the whole management side of things in virtualised environments is feedback that we have regularly got from the register audience telling us that they need better solutions to do this and better guidance on how to use those solutions.
Okay, so somewhat where we got to so far on this.
So, what are the challenges of IT security, just in general, so that we can compare that with, how does virtualization change things? Does it change things at all? One of the feedback that we get regularly when we poll the audience is that people really don't have a good knowledge of what systems they have deployed. And that's in the physical world, before virtualization became really widely used. And we know that it's really easy to spin up new virtual machines, and so that lack of accurate, up-to-date inventory asset-type information is potentially getting much worse with the speed of doing things in virtualized environments. And it's really key to have that information in hand so that you know what you need to protect in the first place and who's using it, coupled in with that identity management. So got to get these basics right to be able to do anything, either in completely physical environments, mixed environments, or should you be one of the few organizations that's completely virtualized in there. The next two are really the heart of the problem, and that's about people. Someone has to take responsibility for security at a very high level within the management teams, because we know that if the IT guys out there try and go to their to their customers and say, hey guys, we're IT, we're saying you've got to do this, you can guess the sort of pushback that's going to come. It's got to come from the management involvement all the way from the top, so that people realise, as our earlier slides showed, that security is really taken seriously in the business as a whole. So someone's got to create the policies, sure, and that could be a small subset, but it's got to have active business involvement in there, and people have got to know that it's not just the IT guys that are responsible for security, it's everyone. But that responsibility has to be promoted almost by the senior business guys. Without that, it's really hard for IT to get people to change. Yeah. And changing people is difficult enough at the best of times. Never mind if you're trying to make them do it because of security and IT saying so.
On a linked point, there's a nice comment here. There's one of the guys said there's huge issues around the business not understanding virtualization. What about the flip side, where the company's security department don't understand it?
Absolutely.
And he's saying he's worked in environments where the security team would not approve virtualized solutions because of the inherent risk. So these are organisations that aren't even that aren't even grasping it. They don't know about it, but they don't like it.
I think the flip side again to that is I think IT needs to be able to articulate what is different with virtualization and what's actually the same. And so they can give that kind of balanced picture to security and get that understanding going. Otherwise, we do get into the slight situation that in some organisations it feels like with health and safety, where it's just easier not to do anything because that's the lowest risk option. And that's not health and safety in any sensible sense. But that's the caricature of where we can get to.
Taking this passive approach to it.
Don't have real understanding, then, and it's really something for IT, I think, to drive that conversation.
And in most organisations where they don't have dedicated security specialists, it very much is about getting the management team of the business on board so that they do understand the impacts of it. As you say, there are lots of instances where people tell us that we can't do technology X, we can't do virtualization because of someone says so, whether it's the security guys or the health and safety guys or the finance officer. Someone says no, possibly because they don't really understand what benefits it delivers, they don't understand how it fits into the big equation, and certainly in these security scenarios, it's something that the security guys in those big companies that have got those specialists have got to get on board and work out, well, okay, it's going to happen. And the question is, how do we best exploit it, and how do we make sure that it is secured in our context?
Okay. And I think as we go through into some of the other parts of the discussion, I think we'll bring out some of those things that that will help IT to have that conversation with their security colleagues.
But that education and communication are themes that crop up time after time after time when we're talking about IT. We as IT professionals have not traditionally been very good at that communication side of things. And it's something that we need to do better. And virtualization, because of the speed that it implies that things can change with, and the business expects things to move that rapidly, means that communication becomes even more important than it's always been.
Okay, now, on this slide, look at the big figure here. 60%, Gartner's saying 60% virtual machines will be less secure than their physical counterparts. Yeah. So it does actually sound like those guys who were saying it's inherently insecure might have a bit of a point.
Not actually in this case, because Gartner's point is not because they are virtualized. So these 60% of production virtual machines...
You've lured me into a trap with your slide.
Are less secure for no good reason. So they are not less secure because they're virtualized. They're simply not configured in the same way, for instance. So if you have an Exchange server, typically organisations have very strict rules about how their Exchange servers are configured and set up. And actually Gartner's finding is that just isn't being applied in the virtual world. We're just not attending to the basics on the left-hand side, which is actually pretty shaming. I mean, it's something that can tend to happen with new technologies, and particularly, as we were saying before, sometimes introduced by a specific team or a project team that doesn't adhere to all the other standards. So I think job number one is to stop that occurrence on the right-hand side. So there is no good reason why those production virtual machines are any less secure. As far as Gartner's concerned, that figure is just based to how we set them up and how we manage them and control them. And we're just not doing what we do in the physical world.
Is the delight at being able to generate these machines
And it's so easy to do.
Isn't followed through into the whole job of securing them.
Or in some cases, the management tools don't see both. So sometimes organisations have got separate management tools for their virtual environments and separate for physical servers. So then you have separate teams who are managing different infrastructure. And so no, the whole issue here is you need to look at security across both. And job one is just do all the basics and make sure you've got all that in place.
So all these things you've listed down here, these are the things that are the same whatever you do.
Yep.
Whether your machine exists as a lump of metal and plastic and stuff,
yep.
or whether it doesn't.
Yeah, so you would patch and make sure that the software running in your Exchange server was up to date. You'd have a policy around how you applied updates. You would make sure that you had the right tool set to make that happen. You could use some of the policy-based features, so you could actually have desired configuration management do that for you and make sure that things adhered to your policy around how you wanted those servers to look. You need to do the same if it's a virtual server. It's not. There's no reason why you shouldn't do that.
And really importantly, the point close to the bottom there is making sure that you can monitor the state of those machines. Because we said that the management and monitoring tools, there's been some problems on the virtual machine side that they've maybe not been quite as good as needed. That's beginning to change. Do you know whether you're using all of the functionality in there in the way that you should be? But if you don't know that something's incorrectly configured, then it's almost certainly going to stay incorrectly configured, or it isn't patched. So getting that asset information out of the virtual machines as well as out of the physical machines to make sure that everything is the way that it should be, and having the policies set up and those processes that Neil mentioned so that you know that everything that's up and running is the way it should be. It's the basics. It really is the basics.
Because there's a question coming in here from, do you not think that getting access control correct is fundamental in virtualized environments? From what you're saying, absolutely yes.
Absolutely, in virtualized and in the physical world too.
Yep.
It's the basics.
Yep.
It really is about process. So those are the things that don't change. So,
okay. So let's have a look at the...
I was going to say, they're not easy to do. We're not belittling that these
takes
things
time.
are...
It takes effort.
Yeah. So this
these
would be
are-
like about a morning's work or something like that. And then in the afternoon...
This is good IT practice. It's not easy, but these are the fundamentals that you have to be sure you can do. And these are, sadly, the things that aren't being done often enough.
And quite often the reason they're not being done is because of the time pressures that all of the IT guys out there are under. Yeah. You know, they're doing more and more, and quite often, if only the business would allow that time to make sure that that the process to create new things and run things are in place, then it ultimately saves time. But you've got to make that investment first to make sure that you've got the policy in place, to make sure you've got the procedure act in this, to make sure that everything that's created is the way it should be and being monitored properly with the right management agents on there. But it needs an investment, and then you will save time later. But of course, IT is very much, keeping things going, and so getting that investment in time is really hard to find.
Well, to that, there's a question that's just come on. Before we move on to the stuff that's different in the virtual environment, we have a comment here that you keep talking about the corporate IT team, whereas this person's saying is there are a lot more virtualized environments being done by external IT services.
Yep.
And do you see them as being a positive or a negative in virtualized environment security?
I think it depends on how well those organisations deliver their environment. So
which ones do you think are positive and which ones do you think are negative?
Couldn't possibly comment, honestly.
But you've got an idea in your head.
So I think this is something that you obviously want to look for in any organisation that you're going to outsource IT to or take a managed service from. And you do need to look at how well they do these things. So do they treat virtualisation as if it's something completely different, or is it a core part of the way they deliver infrastructure? And do they apply all the same rigour and process and tools to effectively managing both together?
You've got to have someone with a compatible security culture to your own.
Yep, culture is really important. But the other thing is that another way that those external people get involved in the virtual machine side is that they come and actually build the stuff first. And when that happens, they may not be doing a managed service or an outsourced job, but they've just created it, got it running, and it's over to you, which then makes the real transfer of information on how to keep managing that going forward really important. But yeah, culture is a fundamental issue in here, but that pervades all of security.
The other side, I think, is it's not all big corporate IT shops.
No.
So if you look at other size organisations, I think, particularly when we talk about some of the specifics of virtualisation, they can have just the same issues as big IT organisations. I think this is a question of scale, but the fundamental challenges are the same, and the way you meet them is the same.
Okay, well, let's move on to what is different in a virtualised environment.
Yeah, because I think we've talked about a number of different aspects of what virtualised environments do differently. This would be really interesting if we can get feedback and some thoughts coming in from the audience as we go through this, because the way it seems to me is, a way of looking at it is, virtualised environments actually change the behaviour that we assume about IT infrastructure. So we assume IT infrastructure behaves in certain ways. We've learned and built up ways of managing based on those behaviours. And that's how we've made those environments more secure over time, and how we manage them to lower cost, for instance. And the problem, I think, is that bringing all the different aspects together, virtualised environments just behave very differently. Unless we understand that, we're not really going to understand the challenge that we have. So these
you might be doing a lot around security, but you end up doing things that are no longer appropriate.
Yeah, or they simply won't be effective, because virtualised environments just do have some specific ways in which they don't behave the way that we expect IT infrastructure to behave. And this, if you like, is the flip side of the whole dynamic data center, dynamic IT, whatever phrase we want to use.
Whatever.
A lot of it comes down to ways in which virtualization just changes some fundamental things. So one is around scale. As I said, be very interested to see if people think these are the right areas, but from what we're seeing, simply the ability to sprawl virtual machines can just completely overwhelm the management tools, the security tools, the ability of IT to understand what's going on. So, and we know from
and we do know from the register readers
you were telling me
that
before
virtual machine sprawl is a major factor for people. In the past, as Neil said, IT was basically designed to be static, and if it ain't broken, don't fix it. We've seen virtualization brought in, putting more eggs in one basket, but it's still been relatively static. But even so, the speed with which new virtual machines can be created adds to a problem there. But it's more that expectation side that Neil mentioned as well, that people think things are going to change more quickly. And so because they think that, they do. Machine sprawl is happening across the board, from very small businesses to very big businesses, and it's got a whole bunch of security issues wrapped up in that. The whole process side. Can your change management keep up? Is it fast enough to keep up with people's expectation of how quickly you can do this? Particularly if your CFO has been reading the airline magazine that says how wonderful virtualization is, and you can do everything in 30 seconds that would have taken you 10 weeks before.
You wrote that article, so it's your fault.
I can barely write with a crayon, so it couldn't have been me. But there are things like that expectation that people don't realise, that behind physically spinning up that machine, it's the process of change management in there. So that, good example, virtualisation is being used a lot to help increase availability of systems. So if a machine dies, it's really easy to spin up a new virtual machine on another physical server. Great. But it's back to Neil's point. Do you know that you've spun up the right version of the virtual machine? Is it the most up-to-date patched version, or is it something that you've just found conveniently in a folder somewhere where you last put it and it hasn't been patched, so you've reintroduced the problem there? So it's about process.
So I think I think there's the speed at which you can create all these virtual machines, and then there's the fact that they can appear and disappear. So if you have a worm infection, the basic approach to that is just find everything that's been infected, patch it all, and you're done.
Scorched earth policy.
Scorched earth policy. The problem is, if you have dynamic virtual environment, then these VMs appear, they infect some other machines, then they disappear again. And that makes it really, really difficult to trace where the infection source is and have the old-style approach to dealing with it.
Particularly if they've been automatically brought up and taken down, then maybe an infected machine has been taken down and saved, and then it gets brought back up again.
Or the user spins up a test machine that's based on a virtual image that they've got, bring it up, it happens to be infected, it infects half a dozen to 50 other virtual environments, they only use it for 10 minutes and then it's gone. Very, very difficult to track. Life cycle. Some of this sounds very stuff that we don't normally think about. Product lifecycle we're used to a software lifecycle that only goes forward by and large. So IT may move back to a previously known state, but in a very, very controlled way. But roll back and roll forward is absolutely fundamental to virtualization with things like the undoable disks and so on. And that breaks a whole series of basic IT assumptions. So re-exposure to security vulnerabilities. If this is done under IT control, then that's something we would automatically take account of. If a user is doing it, they just roll back the virtual machine. They don't know what exposures they are now recreating that were already fixed in the previous version. We have whole protocols that assume certain things may be either going forward only or maybe one time only. The problem is that you can roll back the virtual machine. You can't roll back the attacker's knowledge of what they saw in the previous occurrence. So you're creating exposures or you're breaking whole protocols that assume forward only, except in very, very exceptional circumstances.
There's a lot of pressure on patching.
These sort of things are quite subtle points, aren't they? And they're not things that are going to be widely appreciated outside the IT department.
Yep,
exactly.
And even inside the IT department until they start managing this operationally day by day. And then it's like experience, and you learn by experience. And that's why trying to get some examples of best practice in from outside to buffer that experience first so that you don't have to make all the same mistakes that other people who went first have done.
And there's also an element of being bad cop here to say that there are some things that just you can't do these things because they expose us.
Yeah, the risk of allowing you or me as an end user to be able to do these things in an uncontrolled way is too great. Therefore, it's something that will be either only managed by IT, or you can only create virtual machines that we know are patched, conform to a template, and are secured. And then you can create as many as is feasible for you to go ahead and create. But it's a controlled facility rather than...
And the difficult part there is actually making sure that you've got that change management process in place that can react quickly enough to people's expectations of it. In the past, they may have thought that change management processes took 4 months and a holiday weekend. Now people think with virtualization that change management processes happen instantaneously, but there's still got to be thinking time in there.
If they happen instantaneously, they're going to leave stuff like this behind.
It's a risk.
And then it's too late to catch up. If you start putting that in later, then it's... Yeah.
So the IT director I spoke to who had rolled out a facility, as we were just saying, for users to be able to self-provision virtual environments. And that was great. They came in on a Monday morning, they provisioned the servers they wanted, then they went off and had coffee, and the virtual environments were all there. The problem, as he said, was that they didn't see why everything else in IT didn't work the same way, as quickly as that. Well, not everything can. But I think what we're trying to do here is pick up on some of the ways that we need to think differently about virtualized environments, and then how we go about dealing with that.
There's good news and there's bad news about this. The good news is we've got a ton of comments coming in. And the bad news that means is that I'll have to go through a ton of comments. And the trouble with security comments is they're all incredibly detailed and difficult to read. So you do your slides. I'm going to have a look at these.
Just finish off on these areas where I think virtualization behaves differently, and we need to make sure we understand the ways that we've got to think differently. So one of the big promises around virtualization, one of the great benefits, is you can have a wider range of environments. So you can provide that Windows 2000 environment for your application that you use. You could virtualize that OS2 environment that still runs some application that you still need to run your business.
Tony's got one at home. He does.
Yeah, my other half's got a Win311 app that it's too expensive to buy a new version of.
And that's great. The problem is, one of the things we've done in IT over the years to reduce costs and make things more secure and more manageable is reduce diversity. We've tried to make things more uniform, standardized, and virtualization then reintroduces that for some good reasons. But you still have to think about how secure is that Windows 3.11 environment, how secure is the Windows 2000 environment. In terms
Not
of
very by 2010 standards.
In terms of, is it still supported by the vendor? Is there any... So for all the security vulnerabilities that have been identified since it was published, since it was made available, are those actually being fixed? Is anyone looking at it?
Have you got a license to run it?
Have you got license? But have you got the ability to patch it? So it's all very well saying, yes, we could run that, but are you running it in a way that is secure? Or are you just essentially saying to all the attackers who used to be able to compromise systems like that, come on in. I've got one here. You can break it as much as you like. You thought all these vulnerabilities were closed. Well, here you are. You can have this. Virtual machines just break some of the rules and do things very differently. So they can communicate through virtual networks. They can jump between networks in a way that physical infrastructure we didn't allow to do. So we need to think very carefully about this whole dynamic aspect of virtualized environments, and think about, when we're provisioning a virtual environment, what else needs to be provisioned that doesn't automatically happen just by bringing up the virtual environment.
What things are you thinking of?
So the security, the networking that needs to be built around it. Spinning up the virtual machine often isn't the end of the story. There's some other pieces that have to be manually done in order to create a secure environment around it.
Particularly around the networking side. Most IT shops, networking is not their number one skill. The guys who do everything, rather than the individual networking specialists. The guys who do everything, networking is complicated at the best of times. Networking in virtualized environments is really complicated. And again, because you've got this spinning up all the time, do you know that they're on the right subnetwork? Do you know that they've got the right characteristics? Is your networking infrastructure aware of these machines as well? And then how does that link into the back-end storage? It's all something that's got to be got right. Otherwise, again, holes can open by accident rather than by design.
So there's this mix, this sort of jamboree of automated and manual processes that has to be kludged together.
Yep.
Is this a temporary thing that we just have to put up with? Or is this always going to be with us?
I think the more you can automate it,
yeah,
it's always going to be better. So the more that you have management tools that have understanding of how your infrastructure works, how it fits together, what your policies are, what needs to be done with, when different things are done, what needs to be done with it, the ability to manage configurations automatically. According to your policy, can identify you as Tim, know what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, can allow you to very easily do the things you need to do, but make sure that you can't compromise other things by doing it.
And have the management tools got that sophistication? Well, certainly they're getting better on the virtualized machine environment side. A year and a half ago, when we polled the register audience, they told us they were very unhappy with the management tools that they had available. And that availability of the tools has begun to change. But interestingly, when we've done other research, just asking about management across the board, we find that it's actually almost a byproduct of IT that people have multiple management tools in the first place.
Yeah.
Because in the past, management tools were all pretty siloed, and so you needed 6 or 7 of them to keep everything working together. And that automation side is only beginning to come in, and we know from asking the audience, how easy is it for you to go to your board or to the budget holders and say, we need to invest some money in management? It's one of the hardest jobs for an IT guy to go and get money to buy management tools.
This takes me back to a few weeks ago when we had the guys from the Lancashire Constabulary in here,
yep.
And this was one of them.
Absolutely.
Major concerns, and also one of their major problems. If you didn't see that, it's available on demand. It's really good. It was really. They were very good.
Yep.
They were very open and very honest.
Yep.
And this is still a problem, and it's still in the Windows environment. It's still something where people want more from their tools.
I think across other environments as well. So I think Windows, Linux, whatever. I think the ability to manage across those as well is very important. So you don't just want to have necessarily a Windows-only management solution. You want it to manage your Windows and your Linux, possibly being virtualized on the same physical host together. So that's important as well. Physical and virtual, and hardware as well as software.
Now, we spent some time on this slide because it's important, but it's also quite depressing.
Well, the final one is just finishing off on that, so around responsibility. So one of the key things around security is who's responsible for what, and therefore who has ownership. And virtual machines being essentially files can and are being shared around, like scripts, and modified slightly and then spun up and downloaded. So again, they're something that's very portable. They're not something that IT configures and then makes available. So we need to think of them more as scripts that we need to have some care around and be able to identify. But necessarily they're going to have much more complex ownership.
IT is a community thing. Everybody working in IT usually knows other people working in IT from somewhere else. And if someone finds something good, then they'll tell their friends about it when they're down the pub or when they're out watching the football. And that means that they can go out and say, hey, have you seen this great virtual appliance? You can download it does this and this. Well, what's your process for actually introducing that into the business? The licensing side, the security checking side, and the does it work? Is it going to mess anything up? So it's all about that process again, I'm afraid.
Before we all get too depressed and we start painting virtualization as being the problem,
it's too late. I'm in despair.
I think it's important just to understand these as behaviours that we need to understand, but then look to manage, and the way that the way we treat virtualization and virtualized environments just needs to be aware of the fact that its behaviour is different. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We just need to understand it and plan for it.
And a really important thing here is the last word there about licensing. People always complain about software licensing anyway, but there's also the flip side to that, where everybody thinks that because something's open source that licensing isn't an issue, whereas the open source vendors tell us that actually the way that they have their business models working, they need to know all of the virtual machines that are running in your physical infrastructure. So, you can't just support a single machine, a single virtual machine running on a single physical server if you're deploying it on multiple servers. It's not the way their business models work. So, it's not quite licensing, but it's about the support that's mixed up with that licensing. So it applies equally to the open source side as well as to the proprietary software side. So licensing is really important all the way through here.
OK, let's get on to the good news.
Because, it's important also to say that virtualization provides a number of benefits that allow you to improve your security. So one is continuing the trend in IT around isolation. So we could isolate systems onto separate physical boxes. We can actually now isolate different elements of a system, for instance, into separate virtual machines. That does a number of things. From a security point of view, it means you can isolate the effects of any infection or contamination. But it also means you could configure the security differently for different parts of your application. So you could have very, very specific security for different areas appropriate to what they were doing.
And again, for those really complex configuration scenarios, if you've got a trusted source of actually getting those virtual machine information to you and the configuration wrapped around it right, then again, it's easy to deploy. And rather than having to go to each machine in turn and sit down and try and fire it up and get all the right decimal points in the right place and the right parameters ticked and etc.
And the natural, or one of the ways that extends is, as we're talking about appliances, that's actually a very good way of enhancing security, because you can have a really pre-packaged environment, very, very specifically tailored security configuration. You can just put it in place, and it's very consistent. So virtualization there can reduce some of the complexity and reduce some of the issues of managing security in complex environments. You could reduce the attack surface, you could reduce the access requirements, for instance. The rollback and checkpoint thing that we talked on before, and being aware of how that affects a number of aspects of infrastructure, it's actually fundamental to the whole virtual desktop infrastructure model. So if you're using non-persistent desktops, that wipe and restart is actually key to a whole series of things, but one of them is security. So it has a very positive element to it as well, if you're using it in that way. You can also look at how you test and simulate vulnerabilities. So you can, in the way that you simulate infection and vulnerabilities within a sandboxed environment. So you can test that, roll back, put in some countermeasures, roll forward.
And we do know, again, from the readers out there, that supporting desktops is time-consuming and incredibly frustrating at the best of times. So certainly desktop virtualization offers potential to really reduce both that workload as well as helping to raise the security platform there as well.
And desktop virtualization is just going to be an increasing area of interest. So you can have an unmanaged, untrusted sandbox environment that you run an application in, so that's protected. Or you can do the reverse. You could actually have a very managed virtual environment that you can deploy to desktops you don't trust. So contractors' desktops, or you can have a very managed environment that you do trust on a base you don't.
People working from home in an office.
Got it. Isolation question. That one needs a response from you on here. Fine-grained isolation has terrible performance. Is that this is what someone said? He says great feature in a virtualized environment, isolation. Fine-grained isolation, terrible performance. Do you think the market could react to a redesign of current hypervisor to support component isolation? Is that, have you seen that performance is a problem there, a trade-off that you get?
I think it does depend on the architecture that you have and the way that you implement it. But there are certainly a number of quite established areas. So some of the client-server architectures where this kind of isolation of the different components in separate virtual machines, each configured slightly differently, particularly for security, can be quite effective. We're still in the early stages of doing some of this, so it's not going to work in every case.
And the flip side of that is that hypervisors will get to be, leaner and run individual components more effectively. But as Neil said, a lot's going to come down to the way that applications are actually built in the first place.
Sure.
And as more and more of them are built with virtualization in mind, that's going to become less of a problem. So you use it where you need to today, but in the future, the growth will
more practical. Yes.
And again, none of these things are universal solutions. So isolation works very effectively in some instances. Other cases, no. Performance might be terrible in the particular usage that's.
We don't know exactly what the.
Exactly. Yeah. Everybody's slightly different.
So it's a quick question again, just on the police. It was the last webcast we did.
It was indeed, yep.
What was the name of the webcast? I can't remember.
It's on the final slide we have.
It's on the final slide that we have today. So if you have a look on the slides, even if you want to download the slides and scroll ahead, you'll see. Is webcast number 3, Lancashire Constabulary, talking about what they've done with the virtual...
VDI.
Yeah, VDI.
And actually one of the key things that they were doing was related to security, because what they were able to do was, through using VDI, they could allow their staff, their police officers and other staff, to access differently graded security networks from the same device without having to raise the security level of one or the other. So
in essence, it was security that really drove them down the virtualization path. They considered numerous different approaches and decided that the one that gave them the best security coverage that they required for their business was a VDI solution. And it was completely security that formed the basis of that.
And on the desktop virtualization side, I have a customer, and in fact there are a number of public sector customers who are interested in being able to have a different using application virtualization and being able to run an application in a different security configuration. So if you go to Internet Explorer and you go to your Facebook page and you're looking at that, you can cut and paste and you can move information around. But in their terms, if you go to one of the secure intranet sites with highly secure, confidential, classified information on, you actually are running that in a different security environment. You're running it in a separate virtual machine. You cannot cut and paste into your email and forward that information on to anyone else.
So it's very basic level.
And that can be completely transparent to the user. They just can't cut and paste when they go to secure intranet sites.
They shouldn't be trying, but if they do try, they find they can't.
Yeah, they phone you up, then they'll get told.
Yeah.
Okay, I need to move you on to this because we get the plugs pulled in about 5 minutes on this. So we've got a couple of quite busy slides on this. You're going to have to give us your highlights on this.
Yeah. So again, these two are a couple of slides around what you should be doing to protect the management partition or the parent partition if it's a Microsoft Hyper-V virtualization infrastructure. And then how you should look to protect the guests. So specific guidance on the things you should be thinking about. And this comes actually from, this is guidance that's made available by Microsoft on its TechNet technical site. But it's actually, I think, very generally applicable. From the first point of view, the management partition, the hypervisor, that is where the bigger threat of attack is typically going to be, because if you can compromise the hypervisor, then you have the ability to influence everything else, and you can also hide the exploit. So securing that, securing the management partition, making sure that you're not using that management partition to run other applications. Those sorts of very
typical IT
core
admin
things.
tricks, log in as the administrator and you're there all day.
And don't grant administrators permissions to access
Everybody.
that management partition.
Okay, so I mean, this is basically good practice, but it makes it extremely important in this environment.
Particularly important for the management partition. When we get to the next slide around the guest, then a lot of this is doing, as we were saying before, do the same things that you would do if this was a physical server. There are some other things, so you should look to put some limits on processor usage for guests, so you need to be able to manage the way in which guests can affect each other indirectly. And particularly make sure that all these virtual hard disks and the snapshot files are stored securely, and they're treated as highly sensitive data, because you may or may not know what kind of data is in them. But you also need to make sure that you have that securely managed and taken care of.
Potentially encrypted as well.
Let me move on. I'm whizzing through these, but we need to get to the end.
And the purpose wasn't to go through these in detail. I think this.
No, but I mean, those
the details there for people who want to read it.
Yeah, and if people go to the technet.microsoft.com site, the Microsoft and like other vendors is providing a lot of guidance on all the core basics, and this is just a flavour of that.
It really is about process. Mm-hmm.
I mean, keep saying over again that it doesn't change the fundamentals.
It doesn't.
But what's coming through here is it changes the scale of what you've got to do. If you're not doing it in an organised, strategic way, then you're going to be overwhelmed.
And even more, it changes the expectations of people that you can react more quickly than perhaps your processes in place can help you do that at the moment, or your management tooling isn't good enough to help you do that.
I think virtualization can expose limitations in the way that you manage IT now. So if you can't manage end-to-end, if you can't manage both physical hardware and software together, you can't manage physical and virtual together, virtualization is going to expose that, and it will create more security issues because of that.
And we've mentioned several times that we shouldn't have multiple tools trying to do this, because that creates but do we have sufficient tools and powerful enough tools at the moment?
We know that management tool fragmentation is a challenge across the board, not just in the virtualization space. That the management technologies are getting better. Whilst you may not ideally want to have multiple tools, you probably are going to have them. But what you want to do is minimize them, so that you learn how to fly each of them as well as you need to get the job done, rather than trying just to do the log on with each of them.
And be very clear about the scope. So if you do have multiple management tools, then you want to make sure that it's very clear which tool manages which area, and there's not duplication.
Things don't fall through the holes.
Or gaps. Yeah.
Don't forget to do backup either. So we have heard from people that spinning up these virtual machines all the time with data being changed in them, they don't get put onto the backup schedules when someone tries to recover stuff.
Guys, very quickly then, because we're more or less out of time, I want you to pick one thing out of each of these that you would say absolutely go and do now.
So we talked about management. I would say for me the critical thing is understand these different ways that virtualization behaves, and also manage that diversity. So know what you have, who owns it, where it is, how is it being managed, and get a control on that proliferation and diversity that virtualization makes possible.
Tony, your top tip?
Have the process to actually manage things well. Make sure that you've found the time to get those processes in place to do the job properly, and they're repeatable, and everybody knows what the process is.
Okay, thanks guys, we're out of time. Neil, Tony, thank you very much for your help today. I would recommend that you download these slides because a lot of good information on them, and we can't do it justice in an hour. And there are also some links to look at our other webcasts on this, where you've got real users talking about some things that are very relevant to what we've talked about today. So I hope that's been useful for you. Please let us know on your feedback. We've also got some questions that we haven't been able to answer. There's a few, and so Tony's going to do those. I'm not going to do them. I'm out of here. My name's been Tim Phillips for the Regcast. Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.